Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. All good things must come to an end. This is a fact that motorsport enthusiasts should be keenly aware of. Consider the recent hypercar boom. By the end of the 2010s, top-line endurance racing was on the ropes, with manufacturer interest at an all-time low. But now, just a few years on, it's never been stronger, thanks to a new rule set that's completely reignited the discipline. However, as history has shown us time and time again, it would be foolish to think that it's always going to be this way. Throughout the years, there have been many great racing categories that we now revere for their competitiveness, racing spectacle, or simply because the cars they produced were damn cool. But in spite of our fondness towards them, they all ended up meeting the same fate, being abandoned and often replaced. Whilst you're likely aware of some basic explanations, like Group B being too dangerous or super touring cars getting too expensive, I often find that people don't tend to dive deeper into this topic. How and why did these situations come about? Were they preventable or just bound to happen eventually? To answer these questions, we need to understand why each of these categories were created, how and when they peaked, and then what happened next. Whenever people discuss Group B, the general image they have is of high-power all-wheel drive rally monsters like the Audi Sport Quattro and Lancia Delta S4. But whilst we're very aware of its eventual products, it's not often discussed what Group B as a rule set actually was. Introduced for the 1982 season, Group B was intended for low-volume sports and GT cars. This manifested in its regulations in a couple of important ways. 1. The cars needed to have a minimum of only 2 seats, and 2. Just 200 row-going examples were required for homologation. Although the original Audi Quattro is commonly associated with the early days of Group B, it was actually built to the former Group 4 regulations and then later carried over. In reality, the rule set was mainly aimed towards existing sports cars like the Porsche 911 and Ferrari 308. Models built primarily for rallying, such as the Lancia 037, also fit into this mold. However, once the Quattro proved that all-wheel drive was the way to go, manufacturers decided to interpret the Group B rules in a different way. Making full use of the clause which stated that just 200 production models needed to be made, they designed space-frame machines that were purpose-built as rally cars. In some cases, although they resembled normal road cars, they shared almost nothing in common with them. They were effectively two-seater mid-engine supercars styled after small hatchbacks. This is the origin of the homologation special. At the same time that all-wheel drive was emerging, turbocharger technology was also improving rapidly. When combined with a section in the rules that allowed for evolution models, improved versions of existing Group B cars that only required an additional 20 cars to be built to homologate them, the rate of development was astounding. Another facet of the Group B regs was that the minimum weight of a car was tied to its engine size. For instance, a car with a turbocharged engine between 1.4 and 1.8 litres could weigh as little as 890 kilograms. This meant that manufacturers were incentivized to make their cars as light as possible, with almost no regard for safety. But even with such small engines, they could still make big power thanks to forced induction. Both the Peugeot 205 T16 and Delta S4 had sub 1.8 litre units, and by 1986 were making in excess of 500 horsepower. They also featured aggressive aerofoils that pushed them into the ground and allowed for higher cornering speeds. Seeing the danger in what the Group B category had now become, the FIA planned to replace it for 1987 with Group S. These cars would have been similar to the popular Group B machines, but limited to just 300 horsepower and only requiring 10 examples to be made for homologation. However, before they had the chance to do this, a series of fatal accidents occurred in 1986 as a result of both the dangerously fast cars and poor crowd control on the stages. The most infamous was at the Tour de Corse, where Lancia Works driver Henry Toivonen left the road at high speed, with both he and his co-driver Sergio Cresta being killed in the ensuing fiery crash. This accident is commonly cited as being the final nail in the coffin for Group B, and also led to the cancellation of Group S, which was a controversial decision at the time. From 1987, the Group A category for modified production cars became the new top class of the WRC, but Group B machines were still eligible in various regional events. They also continued to race and win at the Dakar Rally, courtesy of the Porsche 959 and Peugeot 405 T16, models which were intended for the WRC before the ban. Many of the X-Rally cars were also converted for use in European rallycross, and competed well into the 90s. Whilst Group B has become synonymous with rallying, it's worth mentioning that it was also an active rule set in circuit racing. These cars competed in the World Endurance Championship until 1986, when they were phased out as the Group C prototype grid expanded. A dedicated Group B championship was planned, with some manufacturers developing new cars for it, such as the Porsche 961 and Ferrari 288 GTO. However, Group B's demise in rallying had the knock-on effect of this road racing series being abandoned before it even began. As a result, the 961 only raced a handful of times, including at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1986 and 1987, before being retired. The Ferrari 288 GTO, on the other hand, didn't even get that far, as it was never raced, despite receiving an Evolution version designed by Michelotto. However, this model did lead to the development of the F40 road car, and subsequently F40 LM, which competed in IMSA GTO. When you think about it, the GTO class was almost like a spiritual continuation of Group B, as shown with cars like the all-conquering Audi 90 Quattro. In fact, a rebodied Ford RS200 even competed in the series sporadically for a few years, making this comparison even clearer. So yes, whilst Group B Rally was killed off in its prime owing to the safety angle, Group B circuit racing was just an innocent victim that got caught in the crossfire before it really had a chance to take off. In current day, most people don't remember that it even existed. Alongside Group B, the FIA's restructuring of their racing classes in 1982 saw the birth of the Group C category. These were closed-roofed prototype race cars which competed as the top class in the World Sports Car Championship and 24 Hours of Le Mans, effectively replacing Group 6. As these cars were primarily geared for endurance events, it was decided that they would be restricted by fuel consumption rather than engine power. They could only have a 100-litre fuel tank at most, and there were limits placed on how many pit stops each car could make over a given distance. This put a much bigger emphasis on fuel economy, meaning that it was possible for lower power cars to beat far more potent rivals over the course of a long race. In 1983, the Group C Junior subclass, later known as C2, was introduced for cars that were lighter but had even more stringent fuel targets. As a result, they tended to have much smaller and less powerful engines, which were also cheaper to run. This made them very popular for privateers, although they obviously had no chance of competing with the C1 cars that they regularly shared the track with. Whilst the early days of Group C were dominated by Porsche and their 956, manufacturer interest started to surge later in the decade. The balance between power and fuel consumption meant that many different engine layouts were viable. For example, Porsche had their turbo flat 6, Jaguar used massive naturally aspirated V12s, and Mazda employed their unconventional pistonless rotary engines. Just to prove the versatility of Group C, all of them would manage to win at Le Mans. But even though they were geared for economy and race trim, many Group Cs were still capable of extreme performance when let off the leash. At Le Mans in 1988, Welter Racing showcased this when their Peugeot-engined P88 hit an unbelievable 252 miles per hour on the Mulsanne. It's a record which still stands to this day, as chicanes were created to slow the cars down from 1990 onwards. Despite this, Mark Blundell's Nissan R90 CK was able to manage 237 miles per hour in qualifying for that year's event. This was partially thanks to an engine fault that caused the turbo wastegates to stay closed, allowing the car to make over 1100 horsepower, itself also still a record at Le Mans. In the US, Group C cars could be found racing in IMSA's GTP class, but with less of a focus on efficiency, and Japan also had its own domestic championship. By the end of the decade, Group C was a global phenomenon with incredible cars, unrivaled manufacturer support, and massive popularity. But this didn't stop the FIA from making changes. Firstly, the C2 subclass was phased out starting in 1990. At the same time, a new Group C formula was established centered around cars with 3.5-litre naturally aspirated engines. This effectively brought them in line with Formula 1 cars of the era. Now, the reasons for this change have become somewhat hazy in the mists of time, but it's generally believed that this unification was intended to inspire manufacturers to compete in both F1 and the WSC, thus strengthening both series. 1991 was the transitional year in which the new 3.5-litre cars competed alongside the older machines before fully replacing them from 1992. However, the season was in doubt before it even started. The new cars were effectively F1 machines with extra bodywork. Although they weighed some 200 kilograms more, they weren't far off in terms of lap times. but they also weren't far off when it came to cost either. The introduction of the 3.5-litre mandate pretty much instantly killed privateer interest, as the new cars were simply too expensive. This left just the major manufacturers who weren't even getting a great return on their investments. Whilst Le Mans was still hugely popular, the other World Championship rounds didn't garner much interest as grid numbers dwindled. Despite having to invest F1 levels of cash, the marketing benefits were just a fraction of that championship. After pouring in huge sums of money, both Jaguar and Mercedes left at the end of 1991. Ultimately, the 1992 season would go ahead at the behest of Peugeot, but even with Toyota joining, the series was in a pretty bad state. The season finale at Magny-Cours had a field of just 8 cars. Unsurprisingly, the WSC did not return for 1993, but a few manufacturers, namely Peugeot and Mercedes, did use it as a springboard into F1 as engine suppliers. Meanwhile, the domestic Group C scenes in both Japan and America fell apart for a different but related reason. In the 90s, Japan's economy took a sharp decline, and Group C was simply no longer sustainable for its major car makers. This resulted in the JSPC ending after the 1992 season, but also IMSA GTP disappearing the following year. Japanese makes were dominant in that series to the point of killing all competition, so when they pulled out, they took GTP with them. Even after all of this, Group C cars did still linger on for a few years. Due to the category's sudden decline, there was no clear successor lined up to replace it. As a result, some of the cars, including the older spec machines, continued to race at Le Mans. Peugeot's 905 won the event in 1993, and then the Dauer 962, a Porsche 962 that had been converted to a road car and raced in the GT1 class, also managed the feat in 1994. In Japan, domestic Group C machines appeared at the Suzuka 1000 km in 1993 and 1994, and a Porsche 962C appeared in the inaugural season of the All Japan GT Championship, the successor to the JSPC. By the mid-90s, sports car racing had moved on, and the Group C machines were finally consigned to the history books. Well, we've covered Group C and Group B, so we might as well talk about Group A. As mentioned before, the Group A category represented modified production cars, replacing the previous Group 2. Like Group B, it was devised as a rule set for both rally and circuit racing. As long as a manufacturer produced at least 5,000 examples of their model, they could enter it into Group A competition. Starting with the circuit racing angle, within its first few years, Group A was adopted by various championships, from Europe to Japan and Australia. It was a pretty robust rule set that worked well for touring car racing. Cars were often divided into subclasses based on their engine size, which allowed a wide variety of models to be competitive. Like with Group B, there was an evolution clause that allowed cars to be upgraded without having to be re-homologated. In this case, only an extra 500 Evo versions were required, and some marques took advantage of this to great effect. The Ford Sierra RS500 is one such example. Based on the Sierra family car, in race trim it said that it was able to make more than 500 horsepower, an absurd figure for a touring car even today. The Sierra won pretty much every major Group A event, from the BTCC to the DTM, ETCC, ATCC, JTCC, Nürburgring 24 Hours, Spa 24 Hours, Macau Gear, you name it, the Sierra won it. It was unbeatable. Until it wasn't. Because when talking about dominant Group A cars, there is one that's likely to come to mind before any other: the Nissan Skyline GTR. Equipped with an advanced all-wheel drive system, the GTR had an edge that no other Group A machine did. Even when organisers tried to handicap it with extra ballast, it just kept on winning. It was a monster on the track, and so the nickname it earned of Godzilla was very fitting. Whilst it achieved victories all over the world, like at the Spa 24 Hours and Bathurst 1000, it was in its native Japan where it left the biggest mark. From its debut in 1990 to its final race in 1993, the GTR was undefeated in the JTCC, winning 29 straight races. It was a level of domination that seems barely believable in current day. However, this was emblematic of a pretty major issue. At the time, the JTCC divided its grid into 3 classes based on engine size. Division 1, for cars with 2.5-litre or greater engines, pretty much became a one-make category for the Skyline. But what often gets overlooked is that the same was true for the other classes too. Division 2 was dominated by the BMW M3, and Division 3 was the domain of the Honda Civic. Manufacturer competition was pretty much dead in all 3 classes. A few years earlier, the exact same thing had occurred in the BTCC with the Sierra, and this led to the series developing the Super Touring rule sets. These new regulations aim to make the races more competitive, with greater diversity in terms of the cars and manufacturers that were represented. And from the moment that Super Touring hit the scene, Group A's days were numbered. After 1993, it was pretty much abandoned, as most touring car championships switched over to Super Touring. There were a few outliers though, such as the DTM, which went down the route of more advanced Class 1 touring cars, and in Australia they evolved their Group A Holden Commodore into the V8 Supercars formula, which is still around today. As for the Group A cars themselves, whilst most were retired, the Skyline GTR did live on for a few more years, as it was upgraded to compete in the JGTC, winning the GT1 title in the inaugural 1994 season. Although Group A represented top-line touring car racing when it debuted, that wasn't the case in the world of rally. As we've covered, Group B was the dominant force at the time until its sudden abolishment at the end of 1986. Because of this, Group A was suddenly thrust into the spotlight after being very much overshadowed for its first few years. A byproduct of this was that most manufacturers didn't really have a suitable car to compete with, but Lancia were one of the exceptions. In 1986, they brought out the Delta HF 4-wheel drive, and the timing couldn't have been better. The car was perfectly suited to Group A, and resulted in Lancia blowing away the competition. From 1987 to 1992, they took 46 WRC wins and 6 consecutive world titles, making them still the most successful brand in the history of the sport. What I think is interesting is how the competitive outlook of Group A Rally was pretty much the inverse of Group A touring cars. It started off with domination by a single car and brand, but gradually became more even as time went on. At the point when Group A was abandoned for touring cars, it was only getting more popular in rallying. By then, manufacturers started designing their mass-market road cars with rally in mind. This is most obvious when you compare models like the Mitsubishi Galant and Subaru Legacy to their successors, the Lancer Evolution and Impreza WRX. Not only was this helping to make the events more competitive, it was also producing rally machines for the road that normal people could actually afford. A real win-win situation. Although Group A was still proven to be quite popular with fans, the FIA could see that manufacturer interest was starting to decline. So in 1997, they introduced the World Rally Car concept. The basic idea of it was that the regulations would stay the same, cars with 2-litre engines making a maximum of 300 horsepower, but the production model which the car was based on didn't necessarily have to fit the mold of a rally car. This provided a lot more freedom when it came to which model a manufacturer could choose to base their WRC car on, and the modifications they could then make to it. As a result, most brands went down the World Rally Car route, and this opened the door for new manufacturers to come in too. However, Mitsubishi decided to stick with their Group A Lancer, and almost to prove a point, went on to win the next 3 world titles courtesy of Tommy Mäkinen. But in the end, they too would make the switch, debuting their WRC Lancer in 2001. Since then, no new Group A rally cars have competed in the WRC. The thing about Group A Rally that makes it unique in this video is that it was technically never dropped. Group A specs still serve as the underpinning for many rally classes in current day, even though no manufacturers actually bothered to homologate their cars under the Group A requirements. In the WRC, Group A cars were still eligible to enter events up until 2018, and they're still allowed in many regional championships even now. We've already touched on Super Touring, officially known as Class 2, as it was the effective replacement for Group A touring cars. First seen in the BTCC in 1990 and then being adopted by many other series, the basic blueprint was for 4-door saloon cars with a maximum of 2-litre naturally aspirated engines. They could either be front-wheel drive or rear-wheel drive, although Audi were later given special permission to use all-wheel drive. However, the vast majority of manufacturers chose base models that powered the front wheels, so this became the preferred layout. In the beginning, the cars were fairly modest, looking almost indistinguishable from the normal family cars that many people owned themselves. But as usual, it didn't take long before certain teams started to take advantage of the rules. In 1994, Alfa Romeo brought out a special version of their 155 dubbed the Silverstone, which featured a front splitter and rear wing. But with it, they also provided a kit which owners could use to extend the splitter and raise the height of the wing, something which made virtually no difference on the road car, but had a huge benefit for the racer. Thanks to this, Alfa Romeo dominated the BTCC in 1994, despite being forced to run the non-extended wings during the second half of the season. With other manufacturers starting to follow suit with their own homologation specials, the decision was made to level the playing field for 1995 by allowing all cars to have aerodynamic aids, even if their respective base models didn't. At the same time, whilst engines were limited to 2 litres and a maximum speed of 8,500 RPM, there was a surprising amount of freedom beyond that. Manufacturers could use any engine they wanted to from their existing range, and they could then be modified in extreme ways. This resulted in cars that were beginning to push out well over 300 horsepower. With the popularity of Super Touring growing rapidly throughout the decade, it was attracting big-name drivers and teams from across the world of motorsports, with the BTCC being right at the centre. For example, ProDrive was involved with various different brands, TWR supported Volvo, and most famously, Williams ran the program for their F1 engine supplier Renault. So, when you put it all together, there were very sophisticated and exciting cars that normal people could relate to, some of the best teams and drivers in the world, as well as incredibly tense and competitive racing. Really, it's no wonder that Super Touring became a phenomenon, with championships all over the globe. But like many things in motorsports, it came at a cost. The expense required to build the cars inflated as the years went on. As you might expect, engine and aero development were 2 areas that teams invested in considerably, with there being no limit to how much they could spend. But even something like suspension was a massive money sink too. Although there are no official figures that I can find, it's rumoured that some teams were spending 8-digit sums on their BTCC programs. When you then think about how many works teams there were competing at the height of Super Touring, what manufacturer would want to spend that much just to finish 6th or 7th? It simply wasn't sustainable in the long term. From 8 manufacturers in 1998, it was down to 6 the following year, and then just 3 by the turn of the millennium. And many other championships didn't even get that far. The once thriving JTCC had pretty much just become a Toyota One Make series by 1998, before folding at the end of the year. For 2001, the BTCC switched to a new lower-cost set of regulations which they called BTCT, but Super Touring did live on for a couple more years in the Australian and Swedish championships. Super Touring did also have a direct successor in the form of Super 2000, which was first seen in the European Touring Car Championship. These cars followed the same outline as the Super Tourers, but made use of many spec parts to keep costs down, as well as a limit on engine power to prevent another development arms race. Although they never hit the same heights as the Super Tourers, these cars are still fairly well remembered for the racing they produced, and the S2000 rule set was applied in rallying as well. The origins of the GT1 category date back to Le Mans in 1993. With the formerly ubiquitous Group C class still yet to be fully replaced, it was decided to allow GT cars to compete at Le Mans for the first time since 1986. The cars that entered were really just lightly modified road models that were prepped for racing, such as the Jaguar XJ220, which won in class before later being disqualified. With the void left by the collapse of the World Sports Car Championship, a new competition was organised for 1994, the BPR Global GT Series, BPR being the combined initials of the 3 men who founded it. This was a series of events for GT cars that separated them into multiple classes based on performance, with GT1 being at the top. That first year saw models like the Ferrari F40, Porsche 911 and Venturi LM compete for wins. The series returned for 1995, becoming a full championship, and it was bolstered by an expanded entry list. This included the eventual champion in the GT1 class, the McLaren F1 GTR, a car that would also be represented at Le Mans. This year's edition of the event really was the year of the GT1, as not only were there more cars entered in GT1 than any other category, one of them managed to take the overall victory. In wet conditions, the F1 GTR beat out all of the prototypes and secured 4 of the top 5 places. In a way, this achievement really put GT1 on the map. However, the category was about to be shaken up the following year. Having campaigned their 993 911s with minor success, Porsche unveiled the 911 GT1, effectively a bespoke race car that only had a superficial resemblance to the normal 911. As per homologation, 25 road-going Strassen versions were made, but many of Porsche's competitors felt that it wasn't within the spirit of the rules. Regardless, the 911 GT1 dominated in each of its 3 BPR outings and very nearly won at Le Mans. With this car, Porsche had completely changed the direction of the category. For 1997, Global GT was taken under the control of the FIA, becoming the FIA GT Championship. Whereas the previous series was aimed mainly towards privateers, this new championship saw much greater manufacturer interest in GT1. Porsche entered with their 911 GT1, BMW Motorsport ran an updated long-tail version of the F1 GTR, and there were all new cars from Peugeot and Lotus. However, the most significant had to be Mercedes. Until then, they had a works program in the DTM/ITC with Class 1 touring cars. But following both Alfa Romeo and Opel's decisions to leave the series at the end of 1996, the championship collapsed. In case you're wondering, I already covered the demise of Class 1 in a video I made last year, so check that out if you want to know more. Because of this, Mercedes now had a massive surplus in their racing budget, and decided to use this to develop a GT1 machine, the CLK GTR. BMW McLaren started the 1997 season strongly by winning the first 3 races, but Mercedes would then take 6 of the next 8 events to secure the championship easily. Realizing that they couldn't match the CLK, BMW left the series at the end of the year, with the F1 GTR only being raced by privateers in 1998. Meanwhile, Porsche, who had a dismal 1997, developed the 911 GT1 98 that was really GT in name only. However, they still found themselves outclassed by Mercedes, a deficit which only grew when they brought out the CLK LM partway through the year. Porsche would at least get the satisfaction of securing a 1-2 at Le Mans, where both Mercedes retired, but they were utterly crushed in the GT Championship, as the Silver Arrows won every single race. Just like in the ITC 2 years earlier, all the GT1 manufacturers other than Mercedes decided to pull out of the series, with the 1999 championship having GT2 as its top class instead. Most of those brands then switched their focus to the LMP category, which had become the new top class at Le Mans. GT1 cars were only seen in a handful of national championships in 1999, such as British GT. It's also worth mentioning the All Japan GT Championship. Its now ubiquitous GT500 class evolved directly from GT1, specifically the cars entered by Nissan, Toyota and Honda at Le Mans in the mid-90s. Thanks to these manufacturers' dedication to the series, the cars continued to evolve over the years into the totally bespoke GT500 machines we see today. Meanwhile, their exodus from the FIA GT Championship very well could have marked the end of GT1, but fortunately the category was reborn in the new millennium as GTS. The prototype-style machines from the late 90s were done away with, and the class reverted back to its roots, being for modified GT sports and supercars. At this point, the Dodge Viper GTSR was the car to beat, before the Ferrari 550 Maranello took over. In 2005, the GT1 name officially returned, and this coincided with the rise of the Maserati MC12. The eligibility of this car in GT1 was seen as controversial given how few road cars were made, just 50. Some believed that this could lead the category to spiral like it did in the late 90s, with unsustainable low-volume prototypes taking over. As such, the MC12 raced under strict aero restrictions, but even with these, the German Vitaphone team still managed to sweep all 5 FIA GT championships from 2005 to 2009. The low number of production cars did prevent it from ever racing at Le Mans though. In 2010, the FIA GT Championship was broken off into 2 separate series, one each for GT1 and GT2 machines, in an attempt to draw more interest to them. In the inaugural GT1 season, the Vitaphone MC12 continued its dominant run, but Maserati didn't return the following year. At this point, many of the GT1 cars were several years old and in their final season of homologation, but manufacturers were reluctant to develop new ones. To them, it just wasn't worth the cost when compared to GT2 or the emerging GT3 category. As a result, GT1 was phased out after the 2011 season, although the 2012 championship still took place, but using GT3 cars instead. And that's just about it. Looking back at the different examples I've covered today, there are some clear patterns we can see. For instance, cars becoming gradually more expensive and therefore less sustainable is a pretty obvious theme. This often resulted in a category being propped up by a handful of manufacturers, and when just 1 or 2 of them decided it was no longer worth investing in, the whole thing quickly fell apart. Domination by a single car is also another way that we've seen interest in a rule set fall off, such as with Group A touring cars and 90s GT1. At the end of the day, motorsport is entertainment, and whilst one-make championships can be fun, manufacturer rivalries just add that extra spice. Competition and variety are always important. Internal meddling can play a part as well, like we saw with Group C. The F1 engine unification was made with the intention of it strengthening the category, but what it really ended up doing was expedite its decline. And then there's Group B Rally, where a number of factors resulted in the regulations creating a type of car that the rule makers didn't foresee, but still went along with because they were very popular. And by the time they noticed the catastrophic safety issues, it was too late. Their knee-jerk reaction was to then totally abolish it, rather than to try and adapt the rules and make them safer like they originally planned. But of course, not every category goes through the same boom and bust phases. Some just gradually lose favour over time as better alternatives emerge. Whilst I think that many of these racing groups could have gone on for longer had they been handled differently, I believe that they were all destined to end eventually. And to be honest, the fact that some of them were cut down in their prime only adds to the intrigue that we have for them in current day.